If you look at the coverage of what's currently happening in Iran, there's one term that keeps being mentioned.
Artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence.
When people think about AI in warfare, they think about future killer robots. But the reality is that AI is already transforming the battlefield. To understand this, I'll take you to 4 conflict zones. Each one will teach you something different about how war is changing and what's happening right now. In the process, we'll learn why the US believes that AI will reshape the balance of power and why Time magazine talks about a war for AI. So let me show you how AI is transforming today's conflict and what comes next. In today's conflicts, the one thing that has been equated with artificial intelligence has been this: a drone. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense because the drones are the visible part, the thing you can point to, the explosion, really the impact. But that picture is somewhat incomplete because drones are often just the final step, the instrument, but not the intelligence. A lot of the real change is often happening elsewhere, sometimes far away from the battlefield. Now, in military strategy, there's something called the kill chain. First, you identify a target, then you plan the operation, then you execute it. And artificial intelligence is beginning to compress the entire kill chain. And that takes us just right over here. Now, traditionally, locating a head of state is the kind of task that can actually take years. So it means spies, analysts, satellite imagery, intercepted calls, vehicle movements, human sources, thousands of fragments that are gathered slowly. All of that information would then go up the chain into a central command center where it would ultimately be reviewed manually and pieced together by teams of people. This is where artificial intelligence has changed things. In the information age, all of this data gets scaled up exponentially. You all of a sudden have footage from drones flying over city for weeks. You have surveillance footage, movement patterns, logistics data, travel routes, purchasing records. It's not just one stream of information, but many, far too many, for any human to be able to process. The difference is that artificial intelligence can now review all of these data sets that have been gathered, and they can review that a lot faster. And once those targets are identified, AI can also help with the next step. That's planning. How many human staff are we going to need for this particular operations? What kind of vehicles may be available? Are we actually going to do this via land, sea, or air? Artificial intelligence can generate various kinds of options from which then commanders would essentially choose which option to pursue. And precisely this approach is what has been applied in Venezuela. And according to some reports, the same models that were actually used to plan this operations through the various options and then execute it were the same civilian models that you and I might actually use in our everyday lives. And in doing that, it's actually not too different from all of the other applications that we've experienced in business contexts or in personal uses. It makes things more efficient. It can help us bounce off thoughts and generates options for further action. Ultimately, that's the first change. It's how AI compresses the kill chain. It speeds up the journey from information to action. But still, that's only the initial story in the backlog. Because for most people, when they think about AI in warfare, all of this sounds pretty abstract until it becomes physical. And that brings us over here. When the Ukraine conflict started just a few years ago, one of the images that captured the media's and the public attention was that image of a 40-mile convoy of tanks that were heading towards Kyiv. To most at that point, it looked like large-scale industrial warfare of the likes that we had been seeing in the past decades and years. But as the war dragged on, something fundamentally changed. Particularly, Ukrainians started experimenting with a new kind of device that would ultimately change the course of the entire war. What I'm talking about is, of course, drones. Now, most of them were not high-end military systems. They were small, inexpensive, often assembled in workshops by volunteers or maybe technicians using consumer-grade parts. A basic attack drone would usually cost around $500. And that matters because traditionally to destroy a tank, you would require something expensive like, for example, a missile or an aircraft or a precision strike platform, something that would typically require a defense contractor to produce. Certainly not developed in a garage. But with AI, 2 changes have happened. The first one is a mirroring of what has already happened a few years ago with our phones. So historically, you would have required, for example, a separate camera to take pictures or videos. You would have a separate music player like an iPod to listen to music, and you would have a GPS device if you were into hiking and wanted to understand where you were. Then all of that got folded into simply one device that you nowadays just hold in your pockets, your phone. That is now happening with weapons. Take a cheap drone, you add a camera, you add a battery, you add a low-cost AI chip. That chip can run a neural network. It can analyze terrain, it can recognize shapes, it can keep track of a target and continue moving toward it, even when the environment becomes hostile. Suddenly you have something that resembles a lot more a guided missile. And that matters because in modern warfare, the electromagnetic field is often contested. So the other side would jam your signal, maybe the GPS goes down, the pilot then loses track of where the drone actually is and cannot control it anymore, and as a result, the drone effectively becomes useless. But with onboard AI, it can keep going. Now, typically, a hit rate of a drone would be around 10 to 20%, but since that integration of the low-cost AI chips into these self-made drones, the hit rate has reportedly been raised to about 80%. So that's the shift. Consumer electronics becoming not just consumer electronics, but being turned into weapons. And with the combination of AI, they receive some form of autonomy that allows them to navigate independently of human input. But what happens when the battlefield is not just physical, but informational? What happens when you cannot tell anymore what is real? And that brings us over here. After the terrorist attack in Kashmir, the two nuclear-armed states entered 4 days of open conflict. So think about it. Nuclear-armed states, airstrikes, escalation. But apart from that physical battlefield, another one started unfolding online. Within hours, AI-generated content started spreading social media. One of them showed the Pakistani prime minister conceding defeat. Another one showed fake satellite images of a nuclear facility having been hit, to the extent that the nuclear agency had to come out and confirm that there was actually no nuclear leak. All of that culminated when a fake audio clip of a Pakistani commander came out declaring a nuclear alert. Now, the point here is that, of course, all of these footages and images were actually debunked. But by the time that it was confirmed that they were inauthentic and AI generated, millions of people had already seen them. This is where AI is changing today's wars in a different way. It doesn't just impact the battlefield, but it's changing what people believe is already happening. And between two nuclear-armed countries, that's not just some side issue. A wrong piece of information seen at the wrong time by the wrong person could shape a real military decision. That's also not theoretical. In 2025, for example, a NATO exercise reportedly showed that experienced military personnel were willing to make decisions based on deepfake footage. So these were professionals, trained people, simply being fooled. So AI is not just entering war as a weapon, but it is entering as a distortion field. And once you put these images together, a bigger picture starts to emerge. And that brings us where we are today. AI is showing up everywhere at once, in target selection, in weapons guidance, in logistics, in surveillance, in propaganda, in perception. And all of it is accelerating faster than any human can keep up. Now, if you've been watching this far, you might be asking yourself, are there any rules? What are the ethics of this? The debate is happening right now, but not in the places that most people would assume. Now, the most obvious question when it comes to using AI in warfare is, of course, the issue of whether a machine should have a final say over life and death decision over a human being. So think of full autonomy, the killer robots. And that is also where the disagreement begins. Now, on the one side of the spectrum, there's people who say that artificial intelligence and machines as a whole should never be able to make life and death decisions because there's not the moral ground on which machines stay, and they do not have the empathy or the context that any human being might have in their stead. But supporters of the system say that this argument is fundamentally flawed. Just because a human is actually operating in the background, it doesn't mean that a decision is necessarily more ethical. In Gaza, for example, reports suggested that AI systems were generating around 100 bombing targets every single day. And a human being, while still being technically in control and executing an operation, had only 20 seconds to review that. So think about it. 20 seconds to decide whether to click a button or not. What we have today is something far more subtle, but maybe even more important. In almost every example we've looked at, a human was technically still in control, but there's plenty of evidence that shows that AI has a monumental impact on our decision making. It might create outputs that might feel really accurate and really realistic, and in some cases even might be, but the result of that is that we tend to outsource a judgment to the machine without actually thinking critically, without always considering the context. AI is increasingly shaping what humans see, what they perceive to be real, what options they're given, and ultimately, what decisions they approve. The real question is not necessarily whether one day we will be handing control over to machines, but whether piece by piece, step by step, we're already doing it without fully admitting to ourselves that this is what's happening. That is the real shift. Now, full autonomy might not be here yet, but that's clearly where the direction of travel is going. That's where the money is going. That's where the research is going. That is where the military competition is going. And almost nobody has agreed where its limits should be. Now, there have been some initial international resolutions. For example, the UN General Assembly voted 166-3 in favor of regulating autonomous weapons, and only Russia, North Korea, and Belarus actually voted against it. The UN Secretary General requested that there should be a treaty by 2026. Now it's 2026. There's still no treaty. And the reason for that is structural, because the use of artificial intelligence in today's conflicts creates actually a prisoner's dilemma. So if one side adopts it, the other side feels it has to do that as well, simply because no one wants to be the country that slows down while everyone else is accelerating. Because in geopolitical conflict, slowing down can look a lot like losing. To conclude, technology has always shaped the outcomes of war. The Romans used roads and logistics to project power. Napoleon used organization. But AI is different, not just because it is a better weapon, but because it moves perception, judgment, and decision-making into the machine itself. And that is what we're watching happening right now. The technology is here, the rules are not. And in war, the technology almost always arrives first.